Imagine a world where history itself was forged in fire and absolute terror. Can you believe that for centuries, the very heart of Europe lived under a shadow so dark, so vast, and so utterly savage that entire generations believed the apocalypse had finally arrived? This is not just a story of kings and castles. This is the seismic, bone-jarring saga of a civilization carved out of nothing but raw, ruthless determination, only to become the eternal shield against forces that would have swallowed the West whole. This is the untold, adrenaline-fueled history of medieval Hungary. And trust me, you won't be falling asleep anytime soon. We begin not with peaceful settlement, but with an earth-shattering collision. Forget the polite skirmishes you read about in dusty tomes. What happened in the late 9th century was a catastrophe no one saw coming. A whirlwind of horsemen erupting from the east, carrying the stench of the steppe and the promise of utter annihilation. They were known by names whispered in sheer panic from Saxony to Lombardy: Ungri, the Hungarians, the Magyars. But more accurately, they were called the Hounds of Hell, sent by God himself to punish the decadent Christians of the West. Their arrival was not an immigration, it was a military thunderclap. Led by the legendary war chief Arpád, 7 tribes coalesced into a single, unstoppable predatory machine, crossing the Carpathian Mountains and pouring into the vast, fertile void of the Pannonian Basin like water seeking the lowest ground. The speed of their conquest defies rational historical understanding. In the span of a single lifetime, these nomadic archers, whose very saddles were designed for maximum combat efficiency, transformed the political landscape of Central Europe forever. They didn't just defeat armies, they dissolved them. They didn't just take cities, they burned them to ashes, leaving nothing but smoking ruins and the terrified silence of the survivors. The Frankish kingdoms, still reeling from the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, were utterly unprepared for this new kind of warfare. The Magyars were the epitome of asymmetrical combat. They rode small, hardy horses with unbelievable endurance, capable of traversing distances that would break any contemporary heavy cavalry force. And their weapon? The terrifying composite bow. This wasn't just a simple hunting implement. It was an instrument of death, crafted from layers of bone, sinew, and wood, delivering arrows with such velocity and accuracy that they could pierce the heaviest chainmail at startling distances. Their tactic was pure psychological warfare. Sudden, blinding raids, phantom retreats, and the dreaded Parthian shot, firing backward over the horse's rump while seemingly fleeing, turning apparent defeat into a catastrophic ambush for their pursuers. Can you imagine the terror? One day your village is peaceful. The next, a cloud of dust appears on the horizon, followed by the spine-chilling sound of hundreds of whistling arrows and the screams of men who thought their armor was enough. Church bells across Germany began to toll, not for services, but for warnings, hoping to give the local population mere minutes to flee into the nearest stone sanctuary, which often proved useless against the relentless siege engines and determined savagery of the Magyars. They were not content merely to settle their new homeland. Their goal was plunder, tribute, and domination. From their new base in the Pannonian Plain, a strategically perfect location, protected by the mountains and offering rapid access to every major river system, they launched decades of devastating Leta raids, summer raids, that reshaped the destiny of the entire continent. This single victory confirmed the Magyars as the undisputed masters of the Danube region. But they didn't stop there. Their raids became legendary excursions of destruction. They hit Lombardy, burning Pavia. They rode deep into France, reaching the gates of Paris and Orleans. They struck deep into Spain and even threatened Constantinople itself, forcing the mighty Byzantine emperors to pay ruinous annual tribute just to keep the nomadic demons away from the Golden City's walls. For 60 terrifying years, the question was not if the Magyars would strike, but where and when. Europe held its breath, praying that this reign of terror, this nomadic hurricane, would finally dissipate. Every peasant, every priest, every petty duke went to sleep knowing that tomorrow the sound of hoofbeats could mean the end of everything they held sacred. This was the brutal, violent birth of a nation. But even such a powerful force of destruction cannot simply exist solely by raiding. Eventually, even the hounds of hell must face an existential choice: settle down, assimilate, and become a part of the European system they terrorize, or face the combined wrath of the established powers who are slowly, painstakingly learning how to fight this impossible enemy. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown that would decide whether the Magyars would endure as a state or vanish back into the dust of history. The fear was a contagion, spreading faster than any plague across the fragmented kingdoms of Carolingian Europe. When the warning horns sounded, people didn't barricade their gates. They simply prayed to whatever saint might listen, knowing the end was inevitable and swift. These were not the slow, lumbering armies of the West, bound by chains of command and heavy armor. The Magyars were ghosts on horseback, a flash flood of light cavalry drawn from the Carpathian Basin, moving with terrifying, almost supernatural speed that defied the sluggish logistics of their enemies. Their true weapon wasn't the saber or the axe. It was the composite reflex bow, a masterpiece of nomadic engineering that could launch armor-piercing arrows with lethal force, while the rider was at a full gallop, striking targets 300 yards away. They could empty their quivers in the time it took a Frankish knight to simply raise his heavy shield. This was terror warfare perfected. They would strike deep into Burgundy, sack monasteries in Italy, burn villages along the Rhine, and then simply vanish back into the vast, protective plains of Pannonia before any organized defense could even saddle their horses, leaving behind only ashes and trauma. Their strategy, The infamous feigned retreat was a psychological masterpiece of manipulation. They would appear to flee in panicked disarray, only to suddenly turn and unleash a devastating, concentrated volley of arrows into the disorganized, pursuing Western heavy infantry, annihilating them in minutes and turning potential victory into certain massacre. From the sun-baked plains of Spain, where they briefly rode, to the misty forests of Saxony, every ruler understood the bitter truth. Paying tribute was expensive, but fighting the Magyars on their terms was suicide. They treated the entire continent as their personal hunting ground, a constant cycle of plunder and retreat that bled the nascent European states dry and stalled any hope of recovery. But the age of unchallenged predation was drawing to a close, pulled tight by the strings of destiny and the will of one man. While the West was still a fractured mosaic of competing duchies and petty kingdoms, one ruler possessed the granite will and strategic genius necessary to meet the storm head-on. Otto the Great, King of the Germans. Otto knew that simply chasing the Magyars was folly, a fool's errand that only fed their tactical advantage. He needed a solid, disciplined army that could withstand the psychological shock of the feigned retreat and deliver a decisive, overwhelming blow that would permanently erase the nomadic threat. He spent years reforming his forces, relying heavily on the heavily armored, disciplined Saxon and Swabian heavy cavalry, the very men who had failed spectacularly against the Magyars before, but now rigorously trained and hardened by constant border skirmishes and the unwavering threat of his own swift retribution for cowardice. The year was 955. The Magyars, emboldened by decades of easy victories and certain of their divine right to plunder, massed for what they intended to be the grand finale of their terror campaign, a massive strike aimed directly at the heart of Bavaria and the unbelievable wealth of Augsburg. They poured across the border, numbering perhaps 10,000 horsemen under the command of their great war leaders. They poured across the border, numbering perhaps 10,000 horsemen under the command of their great war leaders, confident that the fragmented German defense would crumble as it always had when faced with their legendary speed and ferocity. They had no idea that Otto had been meticulously preparing for this moment. A meticulous trap set with the patience of a king who knew he only had one single shot: to save Europe and cement his own claim to imperial power. August 10th, 955 A.D. The air was thick with tension, and the low, menacing thrum of thousands of hooves meeting the Bavarian earth. Otto's army, comprised of Saxons, Bavarians, Swabians, and Bohemians, stood firm, a wall of steel and piety, refusing to break ranks even as the first deadly showers of Magyar arrows darkened the sky above the Lechfeld.
The Magyars launched their traditional opening salvo, skirmishing, circling, and trying to provoke a chaotic pursuit by feigning weakness. But Otto's commanders held the line, disciplined by the threat of instant execution if they broke formation, their heavy armor absorbing the arrow strikes that had doomed their predecessors.
The nomadic commanders, confused by the unexpected rigidity of the German line, made a fatal, arrogant mistake that cost them their empire. They attempted a vast flanking maneuver, circling around to attack Otto's rear guard, where the baggage train and supply lines were protected by the Bohemian and Swabian contingents, prioritizing plunder over strategy. This was the moment Otto had waited for, the exact tactical blunder he had anticipated. The Magyars, momentarily diverted from the main battle line and focused on easy loot, were now disorganized and dangerously vulnerable to heavy shock cavalry. The Swabian heavy cavalry, led by Duke Burchard, immediately counterattacked with brutal, stunning efficiency, shattering the disorganized Magyar flank guard before they could even draw their sabers. This was the psychological pivot point of the battle, the instant the terror died. The Magyars, masters of the surprise attack and psychological warfare, were suddenly the ones surprised, caught in a desperate close-quarters melee where their bows were useless and their light leather armor was shredded by the focused, systematic force of German swords and heavy lances. The ensuing carnage was absolute, a reversal of fortune so complete it shocked both sides. Otto unleashed his reserve forces into the growing chaos, systematically driving the fleeing Magyars into the surrounding woods and the icy, unforgiving waters of the Lech River, ensuring there could be no escape. The Battle of Lechfeld was not just a defeat, it was an annihilation. The highest-ranking Magyar commanders, including the legendary leaders Lael and Bulchu, were captured alive, a grim, earth-shattering trophy for the victorious German king. The raiding economy, the entire foundation of the Magyar power structure and nomadic wealth, had been violently dismantled in a single afternoon. The surviving warriors fled back toward the Carpathian Basin, demoralized and utterly broken, their reputation for invincibility utterly shattered by Otto's calculated fury. This catastrophe was the defining, irreversible moment for the Magyars. They could no longer roam Europe as predators. The gates were locked, guarded by the terrifying steel fist of the newly established Holy Roman Empire. The choice was stark, existential, and completely irreversible. Settle, centralize their scattered tribes, embrace the sedentary world they despised, and convert to Christianity, or face slow, inevitable extinction at the hands of their vengeful neighbors. The transformation would be painful, bloody, and millennia defining. The Magyars had arrived in Europe to destroy it, but now they were forced to build their own state, a defiant new kingdom carved out of the very heart of the continent they had tried so hard to conquer. This enforced metamorphosis into a legitimate European kingdom is where the true violent history of Hungary begins. The brutality of the nomadic age was over. The violence of forced state building was about to begin, and it would be far more terrible than any raid. The air still reeked of blood
and failure. The devastating defeat at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD was not just a loss of life. It was the catastrophic final realization that the Age of Terror was violently, definitively over. Europe had finally figured out the nomadic playbook, and the heavy German cavalry had utterly broken the light horse archers who once dominated the continent. The proud descendants of Arpád, the men who had tasted the riches of Italy and the horrors of Francia, were now trapped in the Pannonian Basin, surrounded by vengeful, well-organized Christian empires waiting for them to make a single fatal mistake. They were no longer the predators. They were the cornered prey, facing an existential choice: assimilate or be absorbed. In the heart of this geopolitical maelstrom, one man stepped forward to perform the impossible surgery necessary for survival: Grand Prince Geza, a leader whose vision was as cold and calculating as the winter wind whipping across the Danube. Geza began sending tentative peace feelers west, negotiating treaties, and, most crucially, inviting the very enemy he had spent his life fighting, the missionaries. He was performing a political tightrope walk so dangerous that failure meant instant, terrifying annihilation for his entire people. When asked about his sudden, pragmatic turn towards the cross, Geza famously sneered, "I am rich enough to sacrifice to both the Christian God and the pagan idols." This was not piety, it was the ultimate, cynical maneuver of a desperate sovereign, using baptism as a geopolitical defense mechanism, not a salvation. He used the new faith as a formidable tool of centralized power, a sophisticated weapon designed to shatter the ancient, decentralized pagan authority of the tribal shamans and independent war chiefs who still held terrifying sway over their people. The old, free, and savage ways had to die, so the new nation could brutally, mercilessly live. Geza's reign, however, was merely the uneasy prologue to the true horror show. He laid the shaky, pragmatic foundation, but it was his son, the fierce young Prince Vajk, who would cement the kingdom in blood and iron. Vajk was baptized as Istvan, Stephen, a name that would echo across 1,000 years, symbolizing both the difficult birth of Hungary and the death of its savage freedom. Stephen inherited a throne balanced precariously on a razor's edge. The powerful tribal chiefs, seeing their ancient rights, their gods, and their autonomy eroded by foreign priests and foreign law, vehemently refused to bend the knee to this young usurper. They saw Stephen not as a rightful leader, but as a traitor, a puppet of the German emperor, and a man who had abandoned the sacred spirits of their ancestors. The most formidable challenge came from Kopani, the mighty Duke of Somogy, a distant relative of the Arpád house, who laid claim to the throne under the ancient, deeply revered tradition of seniority known as the seniorata's. Kopani was not just a rival claimant. He was the rallying standard for every pagan, every warrior who longed for the glorious days of relentless raiding and blood sacrifice, demanding a return to the true, violent Magyar identity. This was not a mere succession dispute. This was a total war for the very soul of the land. It was the apocalyptic clash between the desperate future and the bloody past, between the cross and the bow. and Stephen knew that failure meant the immediate dissolution of everything his father had fought to achieve.
Stephen was forced to turn to foreign steel, a damning indictment of his necessity. He invited heavily armored knights, men of German and Czech heritage, into the Pannonian heartland, led by the formidable warlords Hunt and Posmany. These disciplined Western mercenaries, clad in terrifying, irresistible iron armor, were the exact counterforce needed to break the swift but lightly armed Magyar horsemen loyal to Kapányi. The final, devastating confrontation came in 997 AD. The field became a slaughterhouse, where the disciplined German heavy infantry pulverized the disorganized, passionate charges of the pagan Magyars. Kapányi's forces were utterly routed, their heroic resistance shattered by the very European military machine they once mocked and gleefully plundered.
But Stephen understood that mere victory on the battlefield was profoundly insufficient. He needed to send a message so graphic, so terrifying, that the memory of it would paralyze opposition for generations. What happened next defines the shocking, violent birth of the Hungarian kingdom. Koppány, captured alive, was not merely executed. He was quartered, his body brutally sliced into 4 massive pieces. And then, in a chilling, deliberate display of political theater designed to crush the spirit of rebellion, those 4 parts were sent out to the 4 corners of the newly controlled territory. 1 piece to Győr, 1 to Esztergom, 1 to Gyula's territory in distant Transylvania, and 1 to his own seat in Veszprém.
This was the seismic moment. The legend of the Hounds of Hell was violently rewritten into the foundation myth of a powerful, modern European kingdom, forever bound to the West, but eternally carrying the deep, unforgivable scar of its pagan origins.
They had feasted on the fear of Europe for 70 years, the sound of their composite bows echoing from the gates of Constantinople to the very heart of the Frankish lands. But every terrifying saga must reach its bloody climax, and for the Magyars, that climax arrived with the devastating, definitive force of a German war machine on the plains of Lechfeld in the year 955. This was not just a battle. It was the brutal, agonizing end of an entire way of life, an annihilation so profound that the very concept of the nomadic raid was incinerated in the dust.
Otto the Great, the Saxon emperor, did not just defend his realm, he executed judgment upon the perceived destroyers of Christendom. His heavy cavalry, disciplined and merciless, crashed into the lighter, highly mobile Magyar forces, who were suddenly unable to employ their trademark feigned retreats. They were cornered, trapped, and utterly dismantled in a scene of breathtaking, biblical violence. The great Magyar chieftain Taksin had failed. Now the burden of survival fell to his son, the formidable and calculating Prince Géza, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with ruthless, necessary betrayal of the past. Géza understood the stark, unforgiving equation of the late 10th century. The only way to stop being seen as the enemy of Europe was to become part of Europe. This required the most radical, dangerous, and violent transition possible, the abandonment of the ancient ways, the burial of the tribal gods, and the terrifying embrace of the white-hot cross of Christianity. Geza was a man of savage pragmatism. He recognized that Christianity was not merely a religion, it was the indispensable operating system of Western civilization, the political language spoken by emperors and kings. To refuse conversion was to invite endless crusades and invasions. So the great prince took the necessary steps, allowing himself and his immediate family to be baptized in 972, opening the door for missionaries, diplomats, and, crucially, foreign military advisors and German knights. But do not mistake this for spiritual surrender. Geza was infamous for his brutal efficiency and his cold-eyed cynicism regarding the new faith. He reportedly told a visiting bishop that he was rich enough to worship two gods, his old pagan ones and the new Christian one. This duplicity was a necessary political shield, used to repel Western aggression, while he ruthlessly consolidated his own power. He used the pretense of conversion to justify the absolute execution of any tribal elder or opposing chieftain who dared question the new direction. He wasn't converting souls, he was building a state, and the sheer brutality required to force independent, fiercely traditional nomadic tribes into a centralized feudal structure defies modern comprehension. The old tribal structure, where military power was distributed among clan leaders and autonomous military commanders, was a catastrophic weakness in the face of unified empires. Geza's mission, therefore, was to dismantle the very foundations of Magyar society from the inside out. He had to centralize the military, seize control of the resources, and, most crucially, destroy the authority of the powerful Gyula and Horka offices, who represented the ancient, independent spirit of the conquest. Esztergom became the new, hard heart of this nascent state, a fortress city built not just to keep invaders out, but to enforce the prince's iron will within. The land, once freely roamed by horsemen, was now being carved up into proto-counties, controlled by appointed counts, Ispan, loyal only to the ruling dynasty. This internal warfare was arguably more dangerous than any external enemy, requiring the systematic elimination of competitors like the powerful chieftain Kopanyi, who refused to kneel. Geza was literally forcing a nation of free-spirited raiders into the shackles of feudal compliance, a task that demanded constant vigilance and unending bloodshed. Elders and priests to teach his people the complex mechanics of statecraft, fortress construction, and heavy armored warfare, fundamentally changing the Magyar military doctrine from light cavalry raids to defensive, territorial warfare. It was a desperate race against time. The Western powers were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, any lapse back into paganism that would justify a final, cleansing conquest. Geza's reign was a high-wire act over an abyss of annihilation, ensuring that his son would inherit not a collection of warring tribes, but a viable, if brutally enforced,
political entity. The pagan shamans, the Tultos, who held immense spiritual authority, suddenly found their sacred groves desecrated and their rituals forbidden under penalty of death. The old gods did not surrender their faithful easily. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, waiting for any opportunity to erupt against the new political order enforced by the imported German priests and the prince's increasingly centralized army. Geza was simultaneously the savior and the destroyer of his people. He secured their physical survival by shattering their cultural identity. Every decision was a calculation of brute political force, designed to ensure that when his son, Vike, who would later become the legendary Saint Stephen, took the throne, the foundations for a true Catholic kingdom would be irrevocably set. The stage was now set for the final, bloody metamorphosis. The hounds of hell had been leashed and beaten into submission, but their feral energy was merely being redirected into the service of a crown and a church that would define Central Europe for the next 1,000 years. The greatest violence was yet to come, the violence of becoming officially Hungarian. The terrible, grinding reality of their position had finally struck the Magyar leadership like a physical blow. After the catastrophic defeat at Lechfeld in 955 AD, where Otto the Great's heavy cavalry smashed the remnants of their raiding armies, the message was clear. Europe was done playing games. The hounds of hell had been cornered, and if they did not change fundamentally, the nascent Magyar nation would simply be exterminated, erased from the Pannonian map by the surging Holy Roman Empire. But this wasn't a diplomatic negotiation. It was cultural self-immolation. Geza's approach was famously cynical. He invited Catholic missionaries to his court, while maintaining his own pagan rituals, allegedly declaring himself rich enough to sacrifice to both gods. This duplicity bought him time, but it masked the lethal pressure he was placing on his own people, forcing them to abandon the glorious horse-riding freedom of their ancestors for the heavy, earth-bound burden of feudalism. This was not conversion by sermon, it was state-building by slaughter. Stephen knew that to receive the recognition and protection of Rome, he had to prove he was capable of enforcing absolute loyalty, even if it meant tearing his own family apart. The greatest threat to his new European identity came from within, embodied by the formidable figure of Kopani. Kopani, the elderly tribal chief of Somogy, was the very embodiment of the old Magyar spirit. He demanded the traditional pagan right to marry Geza's widow, Stephen's mother, and rejected the notion of kneeling before a foreign god or a centralized crown. To the vast majority of traditionalist Magyars, Kopani was the heroic defender of their freedom. To Stephen, he was treason personified. The ensuing civil war was the true baptism of the Hungarian state. It was the clash between the raw, devastating mobility of the nomadic archers and the disciplined,
heavily armed Frankish and German knights that Stephen had cleverly imported as mercenaries and advisors. The Battle of Vesprum in 998 AD was not just a military engagement. It was an ideological earthquake that shook the foundations of the Carpathian Basin. It was a horrifying, unforgettable lesson. The old ways were dead. The nomadic democracy was over. The violence of the raid had been redirected, internalized, and harnessed to the absolute power of the crown. With Campania literally scattered to the wind, Stephen secured his claim. On Christmas Day of the year 1000 AD, or perhaps early 1001, the crown arrived from Pope Sylvester II, solidifying the birth of the Kingdom of Hungary, a sovereign state recognized by the highest spiritual authority in the West. But receiving a crown was only the beginning. Keeping it required relentless, brutal administrative effort. Stephen systematically began dismantling the ancient tribal organization, replacing the decentralized leadership with a network of royal counties, the Vármegye, each controlled by a royal appointee, the Ishban. These were the king's eyes and ears, his tax collectors, and his enforcers. He founded 10 powerful bishoprics, forcing the powerful clans to donate vast tracts of land, thereby cementing the church's economic power as a counterweight to any rebellious noble. Land was power, and Stephen was methodically stripping it from the hands of the pagan old guard and placing it firmly under the control of the crown and the cross. The establishment of these institutions was soaked in blood and marked by constant small-scale warfare against recalcitrant tribal leaders who refused to surrender their independence. Every royal decree, every new church bell, every mandatory tithe was an act of aggression against the cherished pagan past. The Magyars were being forcibly, violently, remade for their own survival. They had conquered Europe with terrifying force, but now they were forced to conquer themselves with even greater, more systematic violence. Stephen's reign was a 1,000-year wager, stability and survival purchased at the cost of the soul of the nomadic warrior. The foundation was laid, solid and utterly ruthless, but the true test of this fragile new kingdom was yet to come, the test of continuous existential pressure from both the East and the West. The true horror show of this era was not external, but internal. King Stephen, formerly the pagan Prince Vike, now wielded the holy crown delivered by Pope Sylvester II. But the ground beneath his feet was still stained with the sacrifices of the old ways. He faced not just minor disagreements, but a civil war brewing within his own ancestral lines, led by powerful chiefs who saw Christianity as an emasculating foreign virus. This was not a slow, gentle conversion over generations. This was a forced, brutal reckoning orchestrated by a man who understood that state-building required divine mandate and maximum prejudice against dissent. The pagan chiefs, clinging desperately to the ancient shamanistic power and the wild, untamed freedom of the steppes, viewed Stephen's alliance with Rome and the dreaded Holy Roman Empire as the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal, a chain wrapped tightly around the neck of the free Magyar soul. They preferred the raw, terrifying power of the sky god Tengri, the bone-chilling rituals, and the utter lack of borders to the meek obedience demanded by the new Christian overlords. Stephen was fighting for survival, knowing that if he failed to impose Christian structures, the great powers of Europe would simply label the Magyars as incorrigible savages and annex the whole lot. While Stephen was busy baptizing his own people at the point of a highly polished sword, the two great empires surrounding him watched like hungry, patience-worn vultures. To the west, the nascent but geopolitically terrifying Holy Roman Empire, a Germanic behemoth, saw Hungary not as a sister kingdom, but as an unstable, highly tempting eastern buffer zone, ripe for assimilation. Emperor Henry II and later Conrad II did not trust the Magyars as far as they could throw them. They remembered the scorched earth, the burning churches, and the catastrophic defeats suffered in the previous decades when the nomadic terror reigned supreme. Their forced peace with Stephen was a razor's edge, a fragile, temporary truce punctuated by massive, terrifying border incursions designed to test the young king's resolve and loyalty. Every diplomatic marriage Stephen arranged, every exchange of holy relics, every promise of fealty to the emperor, was a thinly veiled attempt by the Germans to assert dominance and turn the fiercely independent Hungarian kingdom into a vassal state, a mere eastern march that buffered them against the true threat of the Pechenegs and other steppe riders. The pressure cooker of internal religious and external political tension exploded multiple times, ripping the fragile fabric of the new kingdom. The most infamous, most horrific eruption was the Vata Rebellion of 1046, a volcanic display of fury fueled by drought, famine, and the crushing, unbearable weight of Christian tithes and enforced labor. Imagine the scene. Thousands of peasants, disenfranchised soldiers, and rebellious nobles throwing off their crosses with savage glee and returning with terrifying, visceral speed to their pagan roots, howling war cries that hadn't been heard since the Battle of Lechfeld 50 years prior. They weren't just fighting for religious freedom. They were fighting for the return of anarchy and the glorious, terrifying freedom that came with having no master but the sword. They targeted the most symbolic elements of the new faith, the churches, the priests, and the foreign Germanic advisors who had flooded the royal court. This horrific act demonstrated that the transformation was still skin deep. The moment Stephen's iron grip briefly loosened, the ancient feral heart of the Magyars roared back to life with devastating consequences. Stephen, or rather his successors after his death, responded with a crushing, unrelenting force that would make even the sternest Roman emperor look soft. They understood the brutal, unforgiving reality of 11th century geopolitics.
Either Hungary became a fully functional, structured, and terrifyingly efficient European power, or it would be devoured piece by its ravenous neighbors. They instituted the system of vármegye, counties, creating localized administrative and military power centers to ensure absolute loyalty and crush regional defiance instantly before it could even gather momentum. They codified laws so harsh they read less like jurisprudence and more like a list of divine punishments designed to terrify the population into submission. The Arpads were not just building churches, they were forging a state. By taking the untamed, volatile, utterly ruthless energy of the steppe warriors and channeling it into a rigid, structured, and terrifyingly effective feudal system based on land grants and military service. The price of this hard-won stability was absolute, crushing obedience, enforced through mass execution, brutal mutilation, and immediate exile for anyone daring to look back at the glory days of the nomadic terror. This was the true, terrifying birth of Hungary, a nation carved out of continental chaos by men who understood that sometimes the only path to national salvation requires tyranny, fear, and unimaginable levels of systemic violence. They called it state building, but for the next 70 years, Europe called it the apocalypse. The Magyar arrival wasn't a static event. It was a perpetual motion machine of terror, fueled by the limitless plunder and the terrifying efficiency of their mounted armies. The Carpathian Basin became the ultimate staging ground, a dark, impenetrable fortress from which the new lords launched their brutal economic engine, the Great Raids, the kalandozaszok. These were not small skirmishes. These were multi-thousand-man expeditions that stretched the known boundaries of warfare, redefining speed and shock tactics for a continent still struggling to recover from the Norsemen and the Saracens. The crucial element was speed. It was the very definition of their military doctrine. Their Turanian reflex bows were deadly, yes, capable of piercing thick leather armor at distance, but their horses were supernatural, almost mythical in their endurance and swiftness. They moved faster than intelligence could travel, faster than any feudal army could muster, appearing out of the mist like wraiths and vanishing just as quickly, leaving nothing but burned earth, smoking ruins, and screaming silence behind. This mobility was the purest form of psychological warfare, shattering the concept of local defense and proving that nowhere, from the marshes of Lombardy to the distant castles of Saxony, was truly safe from the hounds of hell and their whirlwind destruction. This reign of terror wasn't random savagery. It was perfectly organized, a core component of the nascent Hungarian state identity. Every raid was meticulously planned, executed with cold precision, designed to maximize loot, especially silver, slaves, and livestock, while deliberately minimizing direct, large-scale confrontation with the heavy feudal cavalry of the West, which they knew they could not defeat head-on in prolonged static battle. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming horror. One summer, the riders are seen burning monasteries near the Rhine River, and the very next year they are sacking the opulent ancient cities of northern Italy, crossing the treacherous Alpine passes with astonishing, unprecedented ease.
The raids reached as far west as the Atlantic border of France, south deep into the paranoid, crumbling Byzantine Empire, and north almost to the mysterious Baltic Sea. Europe was utterly paralyzed, caught in a historical moment of profound political fragmentation, where kings were weak, powerful counts were selfishly looking only to their own fiefdoms, and the only truly reliable defense was the speed of your own legs or the depth of your hiding spot.
Monasteries, which served as the treasuries and intellectual centers of the Dark Ages, were the primary, most lucrative targets, not just for their stored gold and reliquaries, but because striking at the wealth and personnel of the Church delivered the deepest psychological wound possible, convincing the peasant populations that even God himself had finally abandoned them to the pagan fury of these terrifying horsemen. The fear became thoroughly systemic, a part of the air they breathed. Church bells ceased to ring warnings effectively, because often by the time the bells sounded their desperate alarm, the Magyar advance scouts were already at the fragile wooden gates, preparing the siege.
Fortifications were hastily and poorly built across the German lands, known as Burgen, mere desperate, pathetic attempts to shield populations that had lost all faith in central governing authority. The desperate chroniclers of the time eventually stopped describing them as mere barbarian invaders. They were recorded in historical annals as the literal armies of Gog and Magog, the demonic horsemen sent specifically to herald the end times and the second coming of Christ.
But even the most spectacularly successful terror machine has its ultimate, predefined limits. The wealth flowing back into the Carpathian Basin was absolutely astronomical, consolidating immense power amongst the Feodalmec chieftains, primarily the emerging Arpád Dynasty, who were attempting the dangerous transition from nomadic warlords and raiders to stable, sedentary European rulers. The very success of the raids created an immediate existential internal contradiction. How do you effectively build a stable, defensible, long-term state when your entire volatile economy relies fundamentally on continuous, destabilizing external warfare against your potential neighbors?
The old ways were glorious, yes. They brought immense temporary power and gold, but they were fundamentally not sustainable in the long run. Eventually, Europe would inevitably stop running and hiding. The fragmented Western powers, particularly the emerging German power under the incredibly tenacious and pragmatic Saxon dynasty, the Ottomans, were finally learning their lethal lessons. They were adapting their defensive tactics, building better, faster defenses, and most dangerously for the Magyars, they were learning to fight the horse archers on their own terms, forcing confrontations they could not easily evade. The moment the Magyars encountered a disciplined, unified, patient force that refused to panic, their fate in the West was sealed. The first major signpost of this turning tide was the brutal, decisive Battle of Riad in 933, where the great German king Henry the Fowler, who had spent years rebuilding his defenses and training specialized heavy infantry, finally forced a confrontation in the open field. Riad was a profound shockwave that resonated across the continent. The famed horse archers found that their signature tactical move, the terrifying feigned retreat trick, failed completely against disciplined German spearmen and shield walls, who simply held the line, refusing to break formation and charge headlong after the tempting bait. Henry broke that Magyar army, proving conclusively that the hounds of hell could, in fact, bleed and be routed. This was not the final, definitive blow, but it was the first dramatic crack in the armor of Magyar invincibility, signaling clearly that the age of unchallenged terror was drawing to a painful, bloody close. The world was watching, and the clock was ticking down to the final, terrifying confrontation that would ultimately decide if Hungary would truly rule Europe or merely survive within its tightening grasp.
The year is 933 AD, and the air itself was thick with the scent of burning ambition and blood-soaked earth. For decades, the Magyars had treated Europe like an open bank vault, raiding deep into Swabia, Bavaria, and even reaching the sun-drenched plains of Italy, leaving a trail of utterly terrified peasants and shattered kingdoms in their wake. Their success was not just military, it was psychological warfare on a grand continental scale.
They were the unstoppable nightmare, appearing faster than light, striking harder than a Roman legion, and vanishing back into the Pannonian basin before the local counts could even saddle their horses. But even the greatest horror show must eventually face its critic. The fragmented German territories, long paralyzed by internal squabbling and sheer panic, were beginning to coagulate into something dangerous, something unified. The man leading this seismic shift was Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, soon to be King Henry I of Germany. Henry understood one cold, terrifying truth. You could not simply defend against the Magyars. You had to beat them decisively on their own terms. He had spent 9 grueling years preparing, buying time through a shaky, deeply humiliating truce, paid for in silver and fear. This truce, brokered after a particularly brutal Magyar capture of a German nobleman, was not a sign of peace. It was a breathing room for mobilization. While the Magyars enjoyed their temporary tribute, Henry was constructing fortresses, training a new type of cavalry, and relentlessly drilling his infantry to stand firm against the legendary storm of arrows that preceded the nomadic charge. The Magyars, confident in their perceived invincibility, and perhaps slightly softened by the easy tribute, continued their smaller probes, not realizing the beast they had been feeding was growing fangs. When the truce finally expired, the Magyars, confident in their perceived invincibility and perhaps slightly softened by the easy tribute, continued their smaller probes, not realizing the beast they had been feeding was growing fangs. When the truce finally expired, Henry sent a message back to the Magyar leadership that was chillingly simple. No more silver.
Only steel awaited them now.
This was the signal for war. Total, unyielding war. The Magyars, viewing this refusal as an insult of cosmic proportions, immediately launched a massive punitive expedition in 933. Their target? Saxony, the very heartland of Henry's growing power. They came in two massive columns, intending to split the defense and maximize the carnage. A tried and true strategy. One column was meant to draw the main force. The other, the larger, would sweep in and destroy everything. But Henry was ready, his intelligence network having finally given him the edge. He focused his combined forces, now featuring heavily armored cavalry, a direct response to the light, swift Magyar horsemen, on the one decisive point. The clash occurred near Riade. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was the first time a major Western European army had actively sought out the Magyars for a pitched battle since their arrival decades earlier. The air was split by the war cries of the Avar's terrifying descendants and the resolute, disciplined shouts of the Saxon shield wall. The early stages were classic Magyar horror. The feigned retreats, the endless hail of composite bow arrows fired with terrifying accuracy, intended to break the nerves and shatter the formation. But Henry's men held firm. The newly trained cavalry, heavier, clad in early forms of chainmail, refused to break ranks and chase the retreating riders. When the Magyars turned for their decisive charge, expecting the typical European chaos, they found instead an unbroken, terrifying wall of steel and determination. Henry's heavy cavalry smashed into the lighter Magyar riders with brutal, unforgiving force, turning the speed advantage of the nomads into a crushing liability. The result was catastrophic for the invaders. The Magyars, accustomed to victory, suddenly found themselves trapped and routed, suffering a monumental defeat at Riade. It was a shockwave that reverberated across the continent, proving that the hounds of hell could indeed be beaten, that their reign of terror was not divinely sanctioned. Riade was a tactical victory, but more importantly, it was a psychological victory that gave Europe back its nerve. However, it was not the final word. The remaining Magyar forces, though chastened, were far from destroyed. They simply shifted their focus, turning their fury south and west, where the kings were still weak and divided.
They continued their deep incursions into Burgundy and across the Alps into Italy, striking as far as the gates of Rome in 937, demanding ransoms from the Pope and leaving the northern Italian plains utterly devastated. The terror was ongoing, but the foundation of resistance had been laid. The next generation of German leadership, led by Henry's son, Otto the Great, learned the brutal lesson of Riade. Preparation pays in blood.
And as the Magyars launched their largest, most ambitious invasion yet, a massive force of legendary archers and cavalry aimed directly at the heart of the emerging German Empire, the stage was set for the legendary confrontation on the Lechfeld, a battlefield that would either crown Otto as the savior of Europe or condemn the continent to continued subjugation. The stakes had never been higher,
and the fate of the entire known world was about to be decided in one blinding flash of steel and fire.
The year is now 933 AD. For decades, Europe had lived in a state of perpetual, screaming nightmare. The Magyars weren't just invaders, they were a force of nature, a plague riding on the backs of swift, unrelenting horses, appearing from the east like a crimson comet and vanishing just as fast.
Every church bell was a warning. Every distant drumbeat was the sound of approaching doom. And the prayers offered up by frightened bishops felt utterly useless against these hounds of hell who seemed to defy the laws of physics and warfare. The vast, vulnerable body of the continent was being bled dry by 1,000 tiny, agonizing cuts, and no leader seemed capable of staunching the flow.
The continent was paralyzed by psychological terror, a dread so profound that it often caused regional militias to break and flee before the first arrow even touched their shields. The Magyars relied on this reputation, this paralyzing fear, as much as they relied on their deadly composite bows.
But history, as always, demanded a champion, a man forged in the fires of internal political strife, ready to confront the ultimate external threat. That man was Otto, Duke of Saxony, soon to be known as Otto the Great, a ruler whose iron will alone seemed capable of standing against the nomadic tide. He watched the relentless, systematic destruction of his frontiers and knew that the old, piecemeal defenses, the localized Frankish levies, were utterly inadequate to the task of saving the West. He understood that the problem was not lack of bravery, but lack of adaptation. The Magyars used their speed and their devastating reflex bows to dismantle heavily armored infantry piecemeal, utilizing the infamous feigned retreat, a maneuver that had driven every opposing army commander mad with rage and confusion, leading them into inescapable ambushes. Otto recognized the terrifying genius of the Magyar strategy: hit fast, hit hard, refuse direct confrontation, and lure the enemy into a trap. To defeat speed, you needed disciplined, powerful, and equally mobile strength, a lesson the West had forgotten since the fall of Rome. Otto began to change the very structure of warfare in the West, investing massive resources into training specialized, heavily armored German cavalry units, the ultimate counterstrike force designed specifically to neutralize the nomadic advantage. These were not the ill-disciplined peasants dragged from the fields. These were professional, iron-clad warriors trained for brutal, sustained combat. Men conditioned to hold formation even when faced with the terrifying sight of arrows raining down like hailstones and the mocking retreat of the nomadic archers. This was the pivotal moment, the true birth of the definitive German Ritter, the heavily armed knight who would define the next 5 centuries of European military doctrine, and finally give the Magyars something to truly fear. The true test of this radical new military theory came in 933 AD, near the small river Riade in Saxony. A massive Magyar raiding party, confident in their invincibility and their tried-and-true tactics, swept into Otto's home territory, ready to reap the usual harvest of slaves and plunder. But this time, the landscape was different. The silence was broken not by panicked flight, but by the ringing sound of hammer on anvil, of steel being sharpened, and disciplined German voices shouting commands. The air tasted of cold, unforgiving iron, not just smoke. Otto deployed his newly refined forces, not chasing the Magyars into open country, which was always fatal, but forcing a confrontation on ground that favored his heavy formations, using the solid terrain as a weapon against the speed-dependent nomads. The heavy cavalry held the line, a terrifying, impenetrable wall of man and horse, absorbing the initial arrow storm with their reinforced shields and mail, refusing to budge or break ranks under the incredible pressure of the rapid-fire archery. For the first time in memory, the Magyars found their arrows shattering harmlessly against a defense that refused to yield. And when they attempted the feigned retreat, Otto's cavalry did not break formation and pursue foolishly. They held, waiting for the precise, devastating moment of countercharge. The shock that rippled through the nomadic ranks was palpable. Their legendary trick, the very cornerstone of their continental dominance, had failed. The hounds of hell realized they were facing a beast that could not only bite back, but was immune to their venom, a wall they could not circumvent. The ensuing fight at Riade was brutal, a clash of two fundamentally different military philosophies: the mobile, terrifying flexibility of the East versus the disciplined, devastating iron weight of the emerging West. Otto's forces crushed the Magyar army, routing them completely, a victory that sent shockwaves across Europe. Riade was a turning point, a psychological victory that proved the Magyars could be beaten, that they were not supernatural demons, but mortal enemies susceptible to superior tactics and discipline. But it was not the end. Far from it. Humiliation spurred the nomads to even greater, more destructive raids across Lombardy and Burgundy in the following decades. Desperate to prove their terror was not yet extinguished, and their military system remained superior. They knew that the existence of a strong, unified Germanic king like Otto posed an existential threat to their raiding economy and their geopolitical dominance. They needed to crush him utterly, or risk being forced back into the Pannonian Basin forever, stripped of their power and glory. The 940s and early 950s became a grim chess match played across the width of Europe, with kingdoms being sacrificed and alliances being forged and broken under the terrible stress of the constant, unceasing attacks. The Magyars consolidated their power for one final, apocalyptic move. And then came the definitive action that would determine everything. In 955 AD, the Magyars massed their forces for what was intended to be the final, crushing blow against Otto and his Germanic realm. They poured into Bavaria and Swabia, a tidal wave of horsemen. They laid siege to the mighty city of Augsburg, aiming to draw Otto into a confrontation where sheer numbers and overwhelming speed would finally prevail. This was not a raid. This was an invasion, designed to erase the German resistance from the map of Europe entirely, to settle the issue once and for all. The Magyars brought every warrior they could muster, their ranks swelled by auxiliary forces, numbering perhaps 25,000 men, confident that even Otto's heavy cavalry would drown under the sheer weight of their assault. Otto, facing internal rebellions and political betrayal, even as the enemy hammered at his gates, knew the time for maneuvering was over. All of Europe watched, holding its breath, knowing that if Augsburg fell and Otto's army was scattered, the gates of the West would be blown wide open, and the true dark age of the hounds of hell would truly begin. The stage was set for the bloodiest, most consequential battle the continent had seen in generations, a reckoning known forever as the Battle of Lechfeld, where the fate of the entire medieval world would hang on a thread of steel and the courage of one king.